Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'll be giving you guys an update on the willow here and also cutting it back, as this is now the right time of year to be pollarding it. So in previous years what we've done with this willow is we've been cutting it back in a pollard fashion. So I think this is about 2 or 3 years we've been doing this for now, and they put on a huge amount of growth. Last year I think it was over 4 meters. I'll be measuring it again this year and seeing how much height we've got. But basically we cut it down to about 1 meter in height. So you can see here, so previously you can see last year it would have been at this height, and then we cut it back and it's put up about 4 or 5 shoots. Now the first year we did it, each plant put up about 1 shoot. The next year it put up about 3 or 4. This year it seems to be 5 or 6 per plant. So, and even last year, even though they had about 4 shoots per plant, only 1 or 2 of the shoots got right up to the top. Most of them were a lot shorter, so it's been getting a lot bigger every year. This year it's not a huge amount taller, but the average height is much higher. So as I say, the tallest one is about as high as was last year, but there's a lot all at that similar height. So it's really put on a nice amount of growth. Also, it's starting to thicken up nicely now, so I can show you down here. These stems are looking quite sturdy. An example of how much it's thickened up is if you look at the top shoot there. That's how thick last year's growth was. So you can see that it was just that thick. The new growth this year is much thicker, and as you can see further down, the whole stem is thickened up, even though the whole tree was only about that thick a year or 2 ago. Now the whole thing is about 4 times the thickness. So it's thickening up nicely. And what we've been doing recently is every winter we cut it down to that 1 meter level, but we're actually growing this as a windbreak, and it works great as a windbreak over the summer and over winter when it's got just the stems. Even without the leaves it does help a little bit. But we have this period between now, so probably about February time, right through to June, July, until the growth gets back up again, where it's quite windswept, and we're in a coastal garden, so we need that wind protection. So this year I'll be doing it slightly differently. What I'm going to be doing is cutting every other one, so every other tree will be cut down in the usual fashion down to the pollard base, then one's left, next one pollarded left, and then pollarded. The idea for that is we're still going to have a good amount of cover. The pollarded ones will still be able to shoot up and produce all that nice long straight growth that we'll use for things like sweet peas and runner beans, stuff like that. So next year we'll be cutting back the ones that we didn't cut this year, and the ones we did cut this year, they'll be left for another year. So we'll go into a 2-year rotation. At the moment it's only a 1-year rotation, but the 2-year rotation, what we should get is much thicker stems and a lot more side branches. So this willow is a type of hybrid willow. It grows incredibly fast if you pollard it, but it only tends to grow long straight stems. And then what happens on the 2nd year is it starts to put side branches on and really start to thicken up the main stem. So you can see there's a couple here with some small side branches, but there's not a huge amount. But next year they'll all put lots of side branches on. They won't put much height on, but the main stems will really thicken up and they'll be a much more sturdy plant. So the other things I'll be looking at in this video are the archways. So this one's actually come along really nice. This is the oldest one. I think it's about 2 or 3 years old now. It's thickened up quite well. I would just be basically cutting all the branches off on this. I don't need to really twist much. I might twist 1 or 2 on the left here where it's a little bit thinner, but generally that's fine. And then I'll take you down to the archway at the bottom, which is a much newer one. So this archway is only a year old. It's starting to break apart in the strong wind, so I need to retie it. It won't need to be tied every year once it's thickened up, but you can still see the branches are very thin in the middle. So what I'll be doing is I'll be tying it back over, but this year I'm going to prune it slightly differently to thicken up the central a bit more. So what's been happening is the edges have grown quite nice and tall. Basically wherever the plant puts out a side shoot, anything below that will thicken up on the trunk. So if it has all the growth low down, everything on the low section of the trunk will grow nice and thick. But if you have it right up high, then everything below that will thicken up. So the problem is at the moment it's putting side branches on the side, the bottom's thickening up, and as you see, as it reaches up, it gets narrower and narrower. By the time it's here, that main stem is really narrow. But if I take all those lower branches off next summer, allow it to sprout lots from here, that whole section will thicken up, and then we'll have a really nice thick branch structure like we do on the other archway. So that's what I'll be doing on this one. I'll be cutting it back a little bit, tying in a few new branches, and then in spring what we'll be doing is cutting off a lot of these side growths that start appearing lower down. But if we have side growths lower down here, but they're coming from the right hand side right over, that's fine, and vice versa. But we don't want low down branches if they're starting on that side. So that should thicken it up nicely. We should get a much sturdier archway that should last a lot better than this one, which is at the moment getting broken apart by the wind. So when it comes to pollarding the willow, it's best done in winter. So it's currently January. Ideally you want to do it before it starts to put on growth, and this willow starts pretty early on. You can see it's already thinking about putting out a few catkins. Last year I was a bit later and I cut this when the catkins were actually out, but I'm doing it at the perfect time now, just before the catkins arrive. So as I said, and I'll just be cutting it with secateurs or loppers or a saw, depending how thick the branches are. But it's interesting to see if you don't pollard the trees, the branches thicken up an awful lot more. So this one here, which hasn't been pollarded much, you can see it's a much thicker trunk, whereas this one on the right, which has been pollarded, is a lot thinner. This one on the left wasn't pollarded this last couple of years because we're making it into that archway, so that's why that's so much thicker, and the narrower one is the one that's been regularly pollarded. So that's the willow now cut. You can still see on this side there's quite a good spread. On the left, I actually left a few of these uncut because they're a lot smaller, especially in this section. And you can probably see there's not much cover there, so I've left them to go up a bit more. Now I have laid them out. There's a lot of them all pretty much the same size. We didn't actually get quite as big as last year. Last year was 4 meters 62 centimeters. It was the tallest bit of growth in 1 year. This year, or should I say last season, 4 meters 22 centimeters, and I'll put the feet in inches on the screen. But you can see there it's quite a good length. There's a lot of them that length this year, whereas last year we just had 1 or 2 really tall ones. The rest were quite low. This year they were all pretty much that height. So I'll show you a quick picture or a quick video clip now of what this looked like this time last year, just before I pruned it, and you should be able to see the average height was a lot lower. Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be pollarding these willows here. These are hybrid willows. So one of the reasons when it comes to pollarding it that we choose the pollard instead of coppicing is it makes it a lot easier for maintaining. So I'll show you, or so they say, I'll explain the difference. So when you're pollarding a tree, what you do is you cut it down to a particular height or a particular branch, and you keep cutting it to that height every year, and it's generally at least a foot above the ground. Maybe it could be 10-20 meters above the ground. Doesn't really matter what the height is as long as it's above the ground, and you just keep cutting it to that point every year. Whereas with coppicing, you cut it right down to the base, and then it regrows almost from the root system, just from the raised stump at the bottom. The difficulty with coppicing is right down at the ground level, so you've got to get on your hands and knees. It's a lot more difficult to cut back. Whereas because we're pollarding here, I've just chosen a nice easy height, which is just under 1 meter, and that makes it a lot easier for pruning. I don't have to get on my hands and knees, just makes it a lot easier for cutting it. And when it comes to cutting the willow, you don't have to worry too much about where you cut it, just to use a particular height that you want to keep it to. There's lots of dormant buds underneath the stem, especially if it's a vigorous hybrid willow, and it's just going to want to grow straight away in spring, so you don't need to worry too much about where the buds are. The buds though, let's see if I can find one for you. They're these tiny little darker sections here. So you can just see there's one there, it's kind of a reddish colour, and there's another red one down there. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the buds and the little breathing holes. Most of these things here are little breathing holes. Now further up on the stem, such as this one here, the buds tend to be quite well spaced out. So you can see that on this one here, it's several centimeters in between each bud, but where they first appear from the stem, there tends to be a whole collection of buds right towards the main trunk. So you just need to cut it off near where it meets the main trunk. There are plenty of side dormant shoots that are waiting to burst out. So you don't have to worry too much about where you prune it. Just pick a particular height and keep it that height. So when it comes to next spring, what I'll be doing is what I did this year, and that is you basically leave the top few shoots, but any other shoots that come off from the plant you remove. The reason for that is otherwise it'll just grow hundreds of shoots, or at least 10 or 20. There'll be lots of small ones, they won't get a great height, and they'll just start to smother themselves out. And they're not going to be very thick, so they're not going to be much use for things like poles for beans and things like that. So I'll do what I did last year, just remove any of the buds or shoots that appear lower down. Just choose the top 10 centimeters or so, leave any shoots on that. That way we only get about 5 or 8 shoots on each plant, much thicker, much stronger, and we don't have this shrubby mess. Also, because we're growing this in the same bed as raspberries, we've got raspberries in the front here, I don't want them to be shaded out too much by the willow. But where they're planted at the moment, with that 1 meter high pollard, all the growth is above the raspberries and they don't shade them out too much, so it works quite well like that. So when it comes to the willow archways, this one I'm not going to do a huge amount. As I say, it's quite substantial already. I'm just going to clear off all the branches, and I might just tie in one or two just to this section here. You can see, as I was explaining before, where you have a major branch coming off, everything below it is nice and thick, and above it is quite narrow. So there's this little narrow section here which could get trained in with something else just to thicken it up a bit. But this one, as I say, it has worked quite well. The only major branch coming from this one is up here, so that's nice and thick all the way down to the base there. And it's just that little section there which it could do with thickening up. So when this regrows next year, I'll try and remove any shoots that come off from here, and I'll allow it to resprout further down on this side. That should thicken it up nicely. But as I say, just generally, I'm just going to be cutting this one back. It's got a good shape already, it's quite solid. It doesn't really need too much work doing to it. So that's this archway now pruned and wrapped back in. Now some of the branches were a bit too thick. I tried to bend them round, they just snapped. I think the willows just got a little bit too thick on some of the branches, so it wasn't as flexible as it might have been. Ideally they should have been wound in probably midsummer whilst the stems were nice and flexible and they weren't too thick yet. But I still managed to wind a lot of them in. As I was saying with this one, it's already got a good shape, so I wasn't too bothered about trying to get lots of new branches in. The main thing is just to cut off the old ones and then let it regrow. If I was just let it grow higher up, this would just thicken up, it would be a bare stem and all the leaves would be at the top. So doing this, it means we're going to have lots of leaves lower down and it will be a nice green archway instead of just being a trunk with a green section on the top. So I did manage to get in a few nice ones. So this section was particularly thin. It was really just this one here. Hopefully it's a bit clearer on this side, but it was mainly just this stem here in this section. It was very narrow. So I've got 3 or 4 new ones here, and I've got a particularly thick one just up here, which is replacing that slightly thinner one behind it. So that's thickened up nicely. That should look really good next summer. And it's already quite solid this anyway, but it's going to get even more solid, and should be able to withstand any of the winds that we're going to have here, because it's quite thick branches and it's pretty strong. However, this one has a lot of room for improvement, so I'm going to be cutting off the thinnest branches. Some of the thicker ones I'm going to be tying in, twist them around as best I can, but I'll probably need to use some twine or some jute twine just to try and tie them in so that it doesn't get blown apart. It gets incredibly windy here in this garden. It's a seaside location, as you can probably hear from all the seagulls, and the winds here can sometimes reach 100 miles an hour, so I'll need to make sure it's well tied in, otherwise it will be ripped apart by the storms that we'll be getting later this year. So that's the willow now tied in. If you see any loose bits, it's actually just the bits of willow on the side that we're leaving to grow into taller plants. So that's all tied in. Now I have used a bit of twine, as I said before. It's very windy here, but it was actually quite tight. So if this wasn't in a windy location, that twine probably wouldn't be necessary, because the willow is so flexible you can tie it around itself and make it with a structure like that. But come summertime, these branches will thicken up, they'll set in that position, the twine won't be necessary anymore. And the reason I use natural jute-based twine is because it's biodegradable, so this will only last a year. Over the summer it'll get wet, it'll start to rot, and it'll naturally just fall off the structure. If I use nylon or something thicker, the problem is it would constrict the growth too much and it would cut into the bark, whereas this will just naturally fall off and break after a year. So works quite well like that. So that's this one designed. I quite like this arch. It's got this kind of unusual kind of wider section here where it goes narrower, and it looks more naturalistic on the right and then a bit more man-made on the left, or more formal. So that's it for this willow update, I think. I'll quickly show you some of the old willow shoots that we used last year. We made pea obelisks over here. As you can see, they all grew, and they grew up quite nicely. The bits that we used to tie them around the edges, they obviously weren't in the ground, so they have died off and they're just dead sticks now. But anything that went in the ground last year, pretty much 100% rooting rate, and as you can see they've got much bigger. So what we'll probably do this year is actually use these canes again, just pull them out of the ground, stick them in the ground, and just move the canes over onto the next rotation, because we've got a 4-plot rotation here. So these will just move one to the clockwise direction, and fit in that area over there. And I've also got the ones from the sweet peas as well, so I need to do a bit of pruning on them. Looks like one of them might have got damaged by the wind even, as you can see a split there. As I say, that's all for this video update on the willow. I'll give you guys an update probably sometime in spring or summer when they're starting to put on lots of new growth again, and I'm sure it should get bigger every year. We'll get more and more material. As you can see, there's loads of it all over the garden at the moment, so we can use this for lots of peas and beans and things like that. And the smaller pieces we can either use for kindling, or we might even try and put a willow fence in. We need to replace this bit of fence. It's just fabric at the moment, so it doesn't look too great, so we might even try and make a willow fence out of that.